There is a particular kind of silence that happens after you already know something. Not before you know it. After. It's 1 in the morning. Someone is lying in bed, phone lighting up their face, rereading the same message for the 4th time. They aren't looking for what it says anymore. They're looking for what it doesn't. In the kitchen somewhere, a stack of mail sits unopened on the counter. Bank envelopes. Mostly. The kind you can almost guess the contents of just by their weight. Tomorrow feels like a better day to open them. It felt that way yesterday, too. In a hospital hallway, a man nods along to numbers a doctor is explaining. Already rehearsing the version of this he'll tell his wife on the drive home. The version where it's probably nothing. At an airport gate, someone scrolls through flights to a city they haven't told anyone about yet. Not running away, they'd insist. Just curious what it would cost. None of these people would call themselves dishonest. Most would say they simply haven't had time to sit with it yet. But somewhere underneath that explanation, something else is happening, something the conscious, reasonable part of the mind doesn't get a vote on, because here's the strange part. It is entirely possible to know something and to not yet believe it at exactly the same time. Not because the evidence is missing, because believing it would cost something, a plan, a relationship, an identity, a future that already has a shape in someone's mind. This isn't a documentary about people lying to each other. It's about something far more intricate, the quiet, almost invisible ways the mind lies to itself and makes the lie feel like clarity. There are patterns to how this happens. 4, in particular, that show up again and again, not in careless people. In people who are otherwise sharp, self-aware, and deeply intelligent. And the strangest part of all 4 is this. The mind isn't malfunctioning when it does this. It's working exactly the way it was built to. Habit 1. The story. We'd rather believe the first habit shows up in the smallest, most ordinary decisions, not the big betrayals, the quiet negotiations people have with themselves before breakfast. Picture a woman at a coffee shop, describing a relationship to a friend. She lists the evidence herself, the distance, the short replies, the plans that keep falling through. Then, almost in the same breath, she explains why none of it means what it sounds like it means. She isn't lying to her friend, and this isn't quite lying to herself either. It's something more specific. She's reasoning her way toward the conclusion she can live with. Psychologists call this motivated reasoning. In 1990, researcher Ziva Kunda described how people don't only reach conclusions through logic, they reach for the logic that supports the conclusion they already need to be true. From the inside, it doesn't feel like bias. It feels like thinking. The mind builds a case, gathers reasons, weighs the evidence, but underneath it all, the outcome was decided before the reasoning began. This is different from simply wanting something and getting the facts wrong. Motivated reasoning is more elegant than that, which is exactly what makes it hard to catch. It uses real intelligence to arrive at a comfortable answer. A sharper mind is often only better equipped to build a convincing case, not despite the intelligence, but because of it. Not everyone experiences this to the same degree. Researchers are still mapping exactly which conditions make it stronger: stress, exhaustion, or how much of someone's identity is tied up in the outcome, which raises an uncomfortable question. If this is a mechanism, and not a character flaw, what is it actually protecting? Usually whatever would break if the truth arrived too quickly. A sense of safety, a plan for the future, a story about who someone is and who they chose. The woman at the coffee shop isn't confused. For now, she's protected by a mind that would rather build an elaborate case for staying than sit, even briefly, in the plain discomfort of what she already suspects. We rarely lie to ourselves about the facts. We lie to ourselves about what the facts would cost us to accept. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it changes what the question even is. The question was never simply, why can't she see it? She can see it. The real question is why seeing something and believing it can be two entirely different acts of mind. But protection like this has a price. It buys time, not accuracy. And every so often, reality doesn't wait patiently to be reasoned around. It answers back directly in the exact language of contradiction. Habit 2. Protecting the self that contradiction has a name too, and it might be the most well-known discovery in this entire field. Picture someone who just made a decision they weren't fully sure about, leaving a stable job for something riskier or staying in a stable job. Despite years of quiet dissatisfaction, either way, some part of them still asks, more nights than they'd like to admit, did I make the right call? In the 1950s, psychologist Leon Festinger noticed something almost embarrassingly simple about how people manage that kind of tension. He'd first documented it while studying a small group who believed a great flood was coming, and that they alone would be rescued by a spacecraft on a specific, pre-announced night. When the night passed and nothing happened, most members didn't quietly walk away. Many became more convinced than before. Some deciding their faith alone had already saved the world. Festinger named the discomfort behind that reaction cognitive dissonance. What's genuinely interesting isn't the discomfort itself. It's what people do to end it. Rather than change their actions or beliefs, most people update the story connecting the two until it starts to look like the only reasonable position they could have held. You can watch a quieter version of this happen around a family dinner table. Someone announces a decision, moving cities, ending a friendship, staying with someone the rest of the family has quiet concerns about. Over the following months, their explanation tends to grow more confident, not less, even while the underlying facts haven't changed at all. This isn't dishonesty, it's maintenance. The mind is doing repair work on the self, the same way a body heals a wound, automatically, without asking permission first. And this is where it connects to the first. Habit-motivated reasoning decides what to believe before the evidence is fully in. Cognitive dissonance defends that belief after the evidence arrives anyway. Together, they behave like a closed loop, a mind that can choose its conclusion and then guard it. Researchers are still exploring exactly how far this reshaping can go, and under what conditions people resist it instead. But the basic pattern has held up across decades of study, in contexts as different as careers, relationships, and the occasional doomsday prediction, which raises a quieter question than the first one. If the mind can defend a story this well once it's told, what decides which pieces of that story got notice to begin with? Habit 3. Looking for the answer. We already have the answer lives in the smallest daily habit of all, what people choose to pay attention to. It's late. Someone is scrolling through search results about a symptom, a suspicion, a fear. They don't read all 10 links. They read the first one that sounds reassuring, and they stop there. In 1960, psychologist Peter Wason ran a deceptively simple experiment. He gave people a short sequence of numbers and asked them to figure out the rule behind it. Almost everyone formed a guess right away. Then, instead of testing whether the guess might be wrong, they spent their effort hunting for examples that proved it right. Wason called this confirmation bias. Decades of research since have only made it seem more central to ordinary thinking, not less. People don't usually ignore contradicting evidence out of stubbornness. More often, it doesn't fully register as evidence in the first place. The mind treats it the way a river treats a stone, flowing around it, barely slowing down, This is why two people can read the exact same article about a shared worry and walk away with opposite conclusions. Each one convinced the article proved their side. They aren't reading different words. They're reading with a different question already installed. One searching for reasons to worry less, the other for reasons they were right to worry all along. It's also why arguments about the same long-running problem can circle for years without resolving both. People are gathering evidence. They're just building the case for opposite verdicts. There's a quiet comfort in this habit, which is probably part of why it survives so well. Confirmation isn't only intellectually convenient, it's emotionally calming. Each time the mind finds a piece of evidence that fits the story it prefers, something in the body seems to loosen, just slightly. Researchers don't fully agree on why this bias is so persistent. Some point to mental efficiency. It's simply faster to confirm than to re-examine. Others point to emotional self-protection. Both are probably part of the answer, but there's a limit to how long this can work. Confirmation bias can filter what a person notices. It has a much harder time filtering what they already sense, the specific, wordless unease that shows up long before the mind has built a single argument. So what happens when even carefully chosen evidence isn't enough to keep the truth at a distance? When someone stops choosing evidence altogether and simply stops looking. Habit 4. Not looking at all. Sometimes the mind stops selecting evidence and simply refuses to receive it. Behavioral economists have a name for this, borrowed loosely from an old idea about how ostriches behave. They call it the ostrich effect, avoiding information specifically because it might confirm something a person doesn't want to. No researchers studying this pattern found it in something as ordinary as investing. During stretches when markets were falling, people tended to check their portfolios less often than during stretches when markets were rising. Not because they'd grown less curious about their own money, but because they were avoiding one very specific kind of bad news. The same pattern shows up far outside of finance. It shows up in the unopened envelope on the kitchen counter. In the performance review nobody opens until the deadline forces it. In the relationship conversation that never quite happens, not because there's nothing to say, but because saying it out loud would make something real that, until now, has only been suspected. This is different from the first two habits, and different again from confirmation bias. Those happen after information arrives, shaping how it gets interpreted or defended against. Information avoidance happens before any of that. A decision, usually made without ever feeling like a decision, not to let the information in to begin with. There's some legitimate psychology behind the instinct itself. Facing bad news on your own terms, rather than being ambushed by it, does tend to feel more manageable. The trouble isn't the instinct. It's that the right terms have a way of never quite arriving on their own. Looked at closely, this has little to do with cowardice. It has more to do with timing, the mind trying to control when a pain arrives, since it can't control whether, except the moment rarely shows up, uninvited. The envelope doesn't open itself. The appointment doesn't reschedule itself into finally happening. What looks like patience can quietly turn into a way of life, an entire structure of unopened things, each one holding a truth that stays just as true, whether or not anyone looks at it. 4 habits. Then reasoning toward comfort, defending a decision after the fact, searching for evidence that already agrees, and, when none of that is enough, simply refusing to look. 4 different mechanisms, one shared purpose. All of them exist. To buy the mind time before, it has to believe something it isn't ready to believe. None of this means every pause is a failure of nerve, or that instant belief is always the healthier choice. Some researchers argue a limited amount of short-term denial can be protective, giving someone time to gather strength or resources before facing something overwhelming all at once. The real question in this field isn't really whether these 4 habits exist. It's exactly when they help, and when they start costing more than they protect. The deeper pattern. There's an old philosophical idea that fits this pattern so precisely, it's almost unsettling. In the 1940s, the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre described something he called bad faith, a way of lying to yourself so completely you forget you're the one holding both ends of the lie, not simple dishonesty. A kind of fluency in self-deception, practiced often enough that it stops feeling like deception at all. Sartre once used the example of a waiter who plays the role of a waiter so completely that he starts to believe he has no other way to be. The 4 habits do something similar. They let a person play the role of someone who simply hasn't gotten around to knowing. Yet Sartre wasn't writing about ostriches or unopened mail. He was writing about freedom, and the strange fact that freedom is heavier than it looks. Every truth a person lets themselves fully believe asks something of them afterward. A decision, a conversation, a version of themselves they haven't tried on yet. Seen this way, the 4 habits aren't separate quirks of a distracted mind. They're 4 different strategies for avoiding the same appointment, the moment where knowing turns into believing, and believing requires acting. It's tempting to hear all this and feel a little foolish, the way people sometimes do when a pattern gets named out loud. That reaction is worth questioning too. These habits aren't proof of weakness. They're proof of a mind that takes its own stability seriously, sometimes past the point where the defense is still worth what it costs. Belief someone hasn't acted on yet is still just a suspicion, wearing a slightly more confident disguise. Somewhere, right now, someone is rereading a message for the 5th time, still looking for what it doesn't say. Somewhere else, an envelope is still sitting on a counter, one day closer to being opened than it was yesterday. Even though it doesn't feel that way yet, a flight someone almost booked stays unbooked for another week. Still possible. Still unclaimed. None of this means the truth always arrives too late. It doesn't mean these 4 habits are enemies to defeat, once and for all. They aren't obstacles standing between people and clarity. They're the mind's oldest, most practiced way of being gentle with itself, even in moments when gentleness isn't quite what the moment calls for. Maybe the more useful question isn't how to stop reasoning toward comfort, or defending old decisions, or looking away from hard news. Maybe it's simpler than that, and harder. Not what is the truth I'm avoiding, but what would I have to become if I finally let myself believe it? That question doesn't come with an answer attached. It isn't supposed to. Most real change doesn't begin with an answer. Anyway, it begins with someone finally willing to sit with the question a little longer than before. It's only supposed to sit there quietly, the way the truth usually does, waiting patiently to be let in.